live in a small town in rural Australia. I'm a cyclist and I coordinate sports events, marathons, sell bikes and gear and whatnot. Around 6 a.m. this morning, I drove my bike up the mountain, and on the way I passed a woman sitting by the side of the road. At first I thought she could have been a hitchhiker, but there's no hotels around here and she had no bags. I stopped my car about 400 meters from her, grabbed a bottle of water out of the car boot and walked down to see what was going on. This is the moment I realized she's one of the most gorgeous women I've ever seen. She was probably about 20, pale as hell with long wavy blonde hair to her hips and one of those really German kind of hourglass figures. This chick was crazy hot. She was wearing one of those long summer dresses that beach kids seem to love, which I thought was weird for being in the middle of the Australian bush. I hand her the bottle of water and ask if she's lost or needs a lift back to town. She just stares, doesn't take the water, no blinking. I think, oh shit, she's some kind of crazy. So I ask her if she ran away from somewhere and she just said no and still hadn't blinked yet. I then ask her if she's waiting for someone to come and pick her up and she said no again. I ask where her house is and she said here. I'm halfway up a mountain and there are no houses around here, so I was kind of starting to get really creeped out by this point. I walked back to my Jeep. I was going to drive back down the mountain where there was a phone signal and call the cops and get them to come and sort this lady out. She just follows me and I was like, look, are you sure you don't want me to run you back to town? She just says no, again. So I say, I don't feel comfortable leaving you here in the middle of nowhere. Please just let me take you back to the police station. She just turns around and walks off into the brush, miles from anywhere. And I'm just sitting there like, what the hell? And then I really started to get scared when the bug and bird noises started to come back. It made me realize I hadn't heard a single other sound while I was talking with her. No magpies, no crickets, no early morning sounds at all. I hightailed it out of there and called the local coppers when I reached the bottom of the mountain. I told them I saw a woman up the mountain who refused to get into my car. And then I realized how messed up that sounded and hung up. I swear I hallucinated the whole thing. What the hell was that? I frequently go bushwalking in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia, and have done so since I was a kid with my dad. Sometimes for shorter walks I go alone. Yeah, that could be dangerous, and as a woman I could have added risk of being attacked or whatever, but I carry a couple of knives with me so I don't really feel threatened, and I always bring a satellite phone just in case. I just love and crave that feeling of being entirely surrounded by the bush. Anyway, around 5 years ago, I thought it would be a good idea to do an overnight walk by myself. Bad idea. The walk was fine. 3 or 4 groups of people came by the other way on the first day. I picked a little area to stay overnight towards dusk, cut a few ferns back, and I had a space to stick my little one-person tent. I was maybe 30 meters from the track, mostly out of sight behind trees and such. The usual wildlife noises were going on as I drifted to sleep. Though there was a strange noise, I can only describe it as a bounding sound, like somebody was sprinting through the bush right past me. But it went by way too fast with too few steps to carry a person that distance. Also, if you've ever seen the bush in this part of Australia, you'd know there isn't much space on the ground to walk freely if you're off the track. I felt a bit uneasy, but convinced myself it's probably just stuff falling from a tree or whatever. Next morning I had brekkie and packed my things and kept going along the track. Passed a couple of people going the other way, then was alone again for maybe half an hour. Then I heard the sound of a stick being broken as if someone had stepped on it. The sound came from behind me and to my left, away from the track. I turned around to look and nearly died on my feet. A fair distance into the bush was something standing there and looking directly at me. I wanted to believe it was a person, but it wasn't. I can't judge the exact height, but it was obviously very tall, I'd guess 9 feet. Its skin was dark grey or brownish. It had a horrifically large head with huge black eyes. I couldn't see a mouth or anything. Its arms and legs were really long. I was almost crying. Tears welled up in my eyes, completely frozen, staring at this creature. It was like my legs were locked in position. The longer the stare went on between me and the creature, I had this ever-heightening feeling of absolute dread, like nothing I'd ever felt before. The fear built up, and I suddenly bolted. I sprinted away, continuing on the track. I ran and was too scared to look behind me. Tears were streaming from my eyes as I was running away. I didn't stop until I caught up with some people going the same direction as me. They looked at me and were saying, "Oh my God, are you alright?" I was tired from running so hard for so long. I told them I saw something in the bush and asked if I could walk with them for the rest of the way. It took me 6 months, but I did start bushwalking again. But I never go alone these days. You couldn't pay me to do it. For some background, I grew up involved in scouting and left around the age of 15. I've recently become involved again as a leader, and I'd forgotten about my experiences camping in rural Australia until revisiting a campsite and reminiscing on some scary stories. I figured I would share it here and potentially get some insight on what this may have been. I was about 13 or 14 at the time and had gone on a camping trip with my troop. We went to a campsite we stayed at often, as it was only around 30 minutes away from our city. It was large and open to account for many scouts, as it acted as a hub for my state's combined activities that all groups would attend. But this particular camp was only for our group, which consisted of 10 to 12 people. We set up camp in a back corner of the campsite, which was backed by a fence and thick trees, leading to a cliff overlooking a river if you walked far enough. We arrived around 6 p.m., set up camp, and basically went straight to bed. In the center of the campsite was a large toilet block surrounded by rocks and separated into 4 sections: male and female, adult and youth. Our campsite was probably about 300 or so meters from this block. The first 2 nights went without incident, but it was our 3rd night that something occurred that left myself and 2 others with a sleepless night and an apprehension to camping there ever again. It was 3 to a 10, and we all hopped into our sleeping bags for our last night before heading home. The others in the tent, Olivia and Jess, dozed off fairly quickly, but it took me a little longer. I've always struggled to fall asleep and stay asleep, so when I seemingly randomly woke not long after nodding off, it wasn't a huge shock. Nothing seemed amiss at first, so I closed my eyes to try to fall asleep once again, but it only took a few seconds for me to hear footsteps walking towards the toilet block. We were camped in an area of lush green grass that scrunched under your feet, and the sound of someone walking was distinct in the quiet night. I thought it was strange. I hadn't heard a tent zipper, but brushed it off. A few minutes later, I heard them approaching, still a normal course of events, until the footsteps stopped outside our tent. I looked over and both Olivia and Jess were sound asleep, so I knew it wasn't one of them. I waited a few seconds and they continued moving, so again I figured it was strange but brushed it off. Then sounded as though the footsteps looped around the group of tents and back to ours, the other side this time. The tents were set up in a line with a fair amount of distance between to account for guy ropes, as wind had been forecast, but on this night the wind was almost non-existent. The person or thing had seemed to walk around the whole line to stop back at ours again, which was second closest to the toilet block in a line of 4. I then heard them walk around the tree line. I sat up, trying to listen as closely as I could now. At this point, I was sure it wasn't one of us. The behavior of the footsteps was too strange, and why on earth had they sounded like they were walking into the trees? I think it was close to 2 a.m. at this point, and I'd had enough of being alone experiencing this and gently shook Olivia awake, shushing her as she stirred. Olivia was my closest friend in the group, and I whispered a quick explanation of what I heard to her. We agreed to wait a while and see if anything else happened. Quite a few minutes passed, I don't remember how many, and the weirdness of the situation had started to wear off, and I was about to suggest trying to fall back asleep when the footsteps seemed to return from where they'd left off, and again stopped behind our tent. Olivia and I shared a look in the dim light the moon was casting in the tent, and I could tell she was as unsettled as I was. We heard them begin to slowly circle the tent, and she silently moved to huddle next to me. Bit by bit, the footsteps began to quicken until they seemed to break into a run. Whoever, or whatever it was, had to expertly dodge our guy ropes to move at that speed without tripping. Every now and then, something would brush the sides of the tent as Olivia and I were holding each other, doing our best not to make a noise. It was at this point that Jess woke up and asked what the hell is going on. She looked over to us, tears forming in her eyes, and shut up, terror crossing her face. She silently moved over to us to join us in our terror-filled huddle. Her question did not seem to faze whatever was making the noise. The sprinting went on for what felt like ages, but in reality it was probably only a minute or so, until they stopped in front of our tent again. I slowly reached for a spare tent peg and gripped it as tight as I could, thinking that in a pinch it would do as some kind of a weapon. The footsteps slowly did their wrap around the tents again before stopping behind ours and retreating back to the tree line. With some insane burst of courage and morbid curiosity, I decided to try and take a look outside. Still gripping my tent peg, I slowly unzipped our tent, trying to be as soundless as possible. The fly unzipped from the bottom, so I laid down and peeked underneath, rather than unzip it and then potentially create more noise. The footsteps had seemed to stop shortly after their retreat and there were no further noises. This would mean that the person would have had to get over a wire fence without a sound, which didn't seem plausible, but I saw absolutely nothing. Needless to say, the three of us didn't get any more sleep that night. When recounting this story to our leaders that morning, we were told we probably just heard a possum or some other animal, an explanation I simply do not buy. None of the other campers had heard anything. The strangest part of this experience to me is that there were no other sounds, other than the footsteps and the occasional brushing of the tent. No heavy breathing or any spoken words or even animal noises. The person or thing seemed to disappear when I went to look. Why was our tent targeted? Had something been looking for a target, and when I awoke it chose us? Why did it just leave after scaring the ever-living daylights out of a group of teenagers? Why hadn't anyone else heard anything? Our tents were decently spaced apart for the guy rope, so it's plausible that the noise was harder to hear for other campers and maybe not enough to wake them, but the sound seemed fairly loud to us.